It's Nigeria's 14th Emir of Kano, Muhammadu Sanusi II, discussed ways Africa can shape inclusive growth with CNBC Africa's Kenneth Igbomor and Fifi on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Cape Town. Take a look.
Well, first of all, I think it's extremely important to remember that when you talk about integration and you have different political systems, political will and commitment are critical. I mean, Europe happened because of the will between the German and the French leaders to make Europe happen, and the need to collaborate and cooperate. The big countries in Africa, like South Africa, cannot afford to be seen to be insular. So things like xenophobia hurt African Free Trade Agreement. Countries like South Africa, like Nigeria, like Egypt, which together account for about 50% of African GDP, have to be the ones that show that they're open to the rest of Africa. But there are also other challenges. If you make Africa one big market, you must also be able to protect the African borders as a whole from external markets. So it would be unfair for countries to open up their markets to African countries who themselves have not closed their borders and protected African industry. Because you could then have deindustrialization through the back door. You could then have companies, for example, you could, from North Africa, bring European goods into Europe, across the Mediterranean, if there's no protection. And then from there into Africa. West Africa, any of the West African countries on the coast could basically have a system that does not protect African industry, not implement the tariffs that we're going to have, because if we're going to have a common market in Africa, that market itself has to be protected. The industries operating on any country in Africa have to feel that they're not going to have goods coming in from China, from Europe, from America, based on tariffs that are not sufficient to protect them for them to make that investment. So beyond breaking down the barriers among African countries, there's a need to put up the barriers, around Africa itself and protect Africa as one market. And if we do that, then we create a market for African goods. We create an incentive for people to come and produce on the African continent rather than produce outside, because it would be more expensive for them to sell and to access that market if they produce outside Africa, which is how all common markets work. The European market is protected. The United States is protected. The UK was protected for a long time because it's got the natural barrier of being surrounded by the sea. And Africa as a continent does have protection, which individual countries do not have. In my country, Nigeria, for example, whatever we did to protect domestic industry would collapse if goods came in from Benin, from Cameroon, through Niger. With all these porous borders, it is cheaper for us to ignore those borders and allow goods to flow freely than to try to police and protect the borders. But we'd like to know that those countries have protected the borders at the coast, that the right tariffs are implemented, and what comes in from Benin or comes in from Cameroon is not produced in China, but actually produced in those countries. Those are the challenges that we're going to have.
Your Excellency, you sound like you're talking about the start of a trade war 4.0, and I speak about this in the context whereby you have got countries that have tried to protect themselves from what they say is unfair trade terms. I'll speak about the US specifically. And then you've got backlash from those countries that are being seen as operating unfairly in terms of trade. My question to you is, in the scenario where you say that the continent should ensure that you don't have the free movement of goods from bigger economies, how do you likely see the pushback, and are we in a position to fight back should there be resistance to our tariffs?
Well, the truth is that a lot of these arguments are not economics, they're just ideological. The argument for free trade and a level playing field was always an argument for Africa to allow itself to be a market for goods produced in industrialized countries who were looking for buyers and be a source of raw materials. And it is well known in development theory that if you remain a primary producer, over time the terms of trade shift against you. And we have seen the result in the increased concentration of wealth in Europe and Asia, and increased concentration of poverty in Africa. It is not the duty of Africans to provide a market for Chinese and American goods. It's the duty of African governments to provide for the welfare of their people. Now, if Nigeria produces cotton and Nigerians consume garments? Why do we need to send our cotton to Europe and Asia to be processed into garments and then sold back to us? Why do we need to ship out? Why do we need to let out the value-added sections of the value chain? If we produce coffee in Africa, which is what Ethiopia has done, it has shown effectively, its farmers have moved from getting 10% of the value chain to 60% of the value chain simply because Meles stood up and said, you know what, we want to produce coffee for Starbucks. We don't want to sell our coffee beans to be processed in Brazil, process coffee beans here. Okay, he said we no longer want to export wet blue to China. Now you've got a big leather industrial park outside Addis, producing shoes and bags and selling to the best brands in Europe. Okay, so you've moved from selling semi-refined and finished leather to selling leather products. That is the model that we've got to work on. And you know, no one is saying make it difficult for people to come and produce. You're simply making it easier and more profitable for them to set up production in Africa than to have production in China. Look, Chinese wages have multiplied 5 times over the last 30, 40 years. In 1980s, leather, if you looked at the textiles industry in Nigeria, wages were about $120 on the average, and in China they were $80. Today, wages in Nigeria are about $100, in China it's about $500. It makes more sense for Chinese companies to produce on the Nigerian mainland and sell in Nigeria. You've got cheaper labor, you've got the raw materials, you've got the market, and just take out the capital than to produce in China and transport to Nigeria. And so you've got to make sure that you provide the right balance of incentives where you're not shutting out those companies from business, but you're saying, come and produce here. Why should Nigeria, which is the largest crude oil producer on the African continent, be importing petroleum products? Why don't you come and build refineries here? Make it easier for people to build refineries in Nigeria and sell products to West Africa, then produce and have jobs in the UK. That's really what I'm saying. And I think what Trump is doing shakes up the received wisdom about global free trade, but it also opens our eyes to the fact that even the United States has realized that it can be hit. The playing field is not level. We talk about level playing fields. It's not level. If you put the Brazilian national team against the under-16 team of Kenya, their playing field is level, but we know who's going to win. And that's where we are. And the great thing about the African free trade area is that now it's not Rwanda negotiating with China, it's not Botswana negotiating with Europe, it's Africa as a continent that would be negotiating with these countries. So you're looking at a market of 1.2 billion. It doesn't matter whether it's set up in Botswana or in Kenya or in Nigeria or in Morocco, you know you have access to that market so long as you produce in that continent. Why should that be a problem?
All right, but we're seeing two of the biggest economies in Africa still not growing as much as they should. Nigeria just printed the GDP figures with growing about 1.9% in the second quarter. South Africa also came in a bit better than before, but
we rebounded from a contraction from the previous quarter, but still.
But not where we should be. Ghana doing amazing, growing at that level. But then, how can we get more of these bigger countries, to improve their economies, and also leaning on the fact that we're trying to get African countries to finance development in Africa?
Well, the truth is we've got to work on continuing to unlock the structural constraints to growth. If you think of Nigeria, some of the initiatives that are ongoing that need to be pursued, for example, is the recent government-to-government agreement between the German government and the Nigerian government, working with Siemens to fix the bottlenecks in the transmission and distribution value chain for electricity. Because one of the key constraints around industrialization is the lack of electricity. And at the moment, the constraint is not generation, it's how to get that generated power to the end users and how to get the right tariffs, okay, and make that system liquid. So if you close off that value chain, where you can set up the industrial zones that have been proposed by the Ministry of Industry all over the country, set up these industrial zones, set up these industrial parks, at the same time work on how you can get electricity to those zones and to collect, okay, so that the generator, the entire value chain has its improvement, then you create one opportunity for growth. Now, those are the kinds of initiatives that need to be pursued. You also need to seriously look at demographic transition. The rate of population growth, the high fertility rates are going to continue to be a drag on per capita income if you don't have demographic transition. And one of a quick wins on that is to invest a lot in the education of the girl child. If you keep more girls in school until they finish senior secondary school, they're 18, you gradually bring down the fertility rates. You gradually bring down the rate of demographic growth. And then you can have an improvement in human capital quality rather than just producing this at the rate at which we've been producing. So these are the kinds of specific initiatives that need to be pursued. If you look at a country like Egypt, Egypt has now come up with some incentives, financial incentives, to encourage low fertility rates. Families with one child have the education of the child paid for by the state up to university level. If you have more than 2 children, you're no longer entitled to state welfare. Okay, so you create an incentive for people who cannot afford to educate their children, to provide them with an opportunity not to have too many and not to have too large. And that way you begin to reduce the rate of growth in the population, and then your resources are able to support improvements in the quality of life.
I'm just wondering if, I mean, getting countries like South Africa and Nigeria to do more in terms of, you know, the overall growth rate on the continent, if the possible solution, as well as what you've already mentioned, lies in fostering stronger partnerships between business and the private sector. And if I have to mention it, if this super advisory international board that you are now on via MTN, along with other former heads of state.
I'm on the board of directors. I'm the group board. I'm not on the advisory board.
All right. But as a former a player in the public sector, coming now on board onto a private sector company, I'm just wondering if that is perhaps a way in which business and government can better understand each other to better pursue the common goal, which is growth for all.
I think it's important that we have this interaction between private sector and public sector. I think it's more important that we focus on the quality of the personnel in the public sector. If you look at countries like Singapore, if you look at countries like the United Kingdom, if you look at even China, you'll find that there was a tremendous amount of investment in the quality of people in public policy. So when you sit across from your counterpart in government, you're speaking at the same level. And I'm not just talking about the level of the minister, where you can have a very brilliant minister, and then under him you have civil servants who simply don't understand what's happening. So training of public servants, you know, having a clear understanding of what the direction is. Okay, so for example, if every top civil servant understood that was important to encourage foreign investment, which is what Meles did. I mean, if you go to Ethiopia, if you went to Ethiopia under Meles, if you were investing $5 million in the Ethiopian government, you would see the Prime Minister. And he would ask you what you need. And he would call the officer in charge, and he would say, if you have a problem, let me know immediately. This is my number. You know, Kagame, everybody talks, all the businessmen I know who have been to Rwanda talk about how Kagame is personally involved in making sure that they have all the support that they need. Okay, now when public servants have that common vision and they understand that investment is important and they need to address the needs of the investors in a manner that does not undermine the national interest, you know, then you begin to have the results. And I'm not sure that the big countries have reached that level. There's too much bureaucracy. There are too many people that are involved in the decision-making process. And this is true of South Africa, it's true of Nigeria, it's true of many countries that are behind in this area. You sometimes don't know exactly who to go to. I mean, who would say, yes, these are the terms, go ahead, and then who will take responsibility for pushing this. And I don't think the president of Nigeria, the president of South Africa can do that. The economies are too big, but there should be, in every sector, key drivers who would make sure that that investment comes in and we don't lose it. Because if it doesn't come to Nigeria or South Africa, it will go to another African country or another country outside Africa.
Just a follow-up question real quick. I mean, on that MTN board, what are you hoping to bring to the table? What have you targeted for yourself?
Well, first of all, let me say that I was pleasantly surprised when I was invited to the MTN board because I never asked for it. I never applied for it. I never knew that anybody was considering me, for the board of MTN. I think the MTN board itself decided that because it wanted to broaden its board in Africa and bring in Africans that were non-South Africans, it needed to find people, and Nigeria was its biggest market, it's in Nigeria. I believe the MTN board was also looking at the fact that there were issues that had been raised around governance because of the tax issues and so on, and they wanted people who had some experience in corporate governance and regulation to advise the board. And I have found on the board at the moment, it's not so much what I'm bringing to the board, what I'm learning in the few months I've been there, because IT and ICT really is not my space, telecom's not my space, and I'm sitting with a group of incredibly intelligent people who are doing incredible things. I can see the great potentials that telecoms has in Africa. I wouldn't want to talk specifically about MTN since I'm on the board, but telecoms generally has great potential when you look at things like financial inclusion and the digital space. So for me, it's more joining colleagues and seeing how we can improve on the corporate governance and MTN, also how we can make MTN grow in a manner that contributes to African growth. And in some parts of the group have done extremely well. Nigeria's done well, Ghana's done well, and the fact that MTN continues to operate in places like Yemen, places like Iran, places like the Sudan, with all the challenges, it gives me, for example, an opportunity to see firsthand some of the challenges that's happening across Africa, and that's my own development.